Chapter 1. The Town That Time Forgot. The road to Timbrewood was long and winding, snaking through dense forests that seemed untouched by time. Maeva watched the towering pines blur past her car window, their dark forms stretching endlessly into the mist that clung to the valley. The GPS had stopped working miles ago, leaving her to rely on the printed map she'd picked up at a gas station hours before. According to it, Timbrewood lay just beyond the next bend, a town nestled in isolation, hidden from the rush of the modern world. She had chosen Timbrewood for its obscurity, its promise of solitude. After the incident, the one she couldn't fully remember, she needed a place where no one would ask questions, where the silence would help her put the shattered pieces of her mind back together. She was running from something, though she wasn't sure if it was the past or herself. As she crested the hill, the town came into view. It was almost too picturesque, a place frozen in time. The houses were quaint, their facades untouched by the modern age. No billboards, no fast food chains, not even a single power line in sight. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional figure moving languidly, as if they had nowhere urgent to be. It was peaceful, too peaceful. Maeva pulled into what looked like the town's only inn, a two-story building with a sagging wooden sign that read the Holloway Lodge. The moment she stepped out of her car, she felt it, a strange pressure in the air, like the weight of an unseen gaze. The feeling passed as quickly as it had come, but it left a lingering unease in her chest. Inside, the lodge smelled of old wood and something faintly sweet, like dried lavender. An elderly woman stood behind the counter, her eyes sharp despite her wrinkled face. "You must be Maeva," the woman said before Maeva could introduce herself. "We've been expecting you." Maeva hesitated. How did you know I was coming?" The woman smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Oh dear. News travels fast in a small town. Something about the way she said it sent a shiver down Maeva's spine. Still, she forced a polite nod and signed the guest book. As she did, she noticed something odd. The pages were yellowed and filled with names, but the dates beside them were inconsistent, scattered across decades, as if visitors had checked in and out over a span of 50 years with no real pattern. Her room was small but cozy, overlooking the main street. From her window, she could see the townspeople moving in slow, deliberate motions. A man sweeping his porch, a woman adjusting a flower pot, two children skipping down the road, their laughter strangely muffled. It was all so measured, as though the entire town was part of a carefully choreographed performance. That night, Maeva dreamed in fragments. A flickering street lamp, a pocket watch, its hands spinning wildly, a faceless figure whispering her name. When she woke, her heart was pounding, though she couldn't remember why. She glanced at the clock on the nightstand. It was exactly where it had been when she went to bed. The hands hadn't moved at all. A chill ran through her. Surely, it was just broken, just a coincidence. But when she looked outside, the town was exactly as she had left it the night before. The same man still sweeping his porch, the same woman adjusting her flower pot, the same children skipping down the street, their movements identical to the day before. Maeva's breath caught in her throat. Something was wrong with Timbrewood. Chapter 2. Flickers in the Fog. The morning air was thick with mist, curling around the rooftops and blurring the edges of the town like an unfinished painting. Maeva stood at her window, watching the same man sweeping his porch, the same woman tending to the same flower pot, the same children skipping down the road in the same perfect rhythm. A deep unease settled in her chest. This wasn't normal. She pulled on a sweater, determined to shake the unease by getting some fresh air. Maybe she was still exhausted from the drive. Maybe she had imagined it all. But as she stepped outside, the mist wrapped around her like a living thing, cool and damp against her skin. The town's silence was oppressive, disturbed only by the rhythmic clatter of the sweeper's broom against the cobblestone street. Maeva decided to walk, letting her feet take her where they wanted. She passed the general store, its display window filled with items that looked decades old: glass soda bottles with faded labels, tin lunchboxes featuring cartoon characters she vaguely recognized but couldn't quite place. No one was inside, or at least no one she could see. She turned a corner and nearly collided with a figure emerging from the fog. A man, middle-aged, with sharp blue eyes and a carefully groomed mustache. He didn't flinch at the near collision. Instead, he regarded her with an unsettling stillness. "You're the newcomer," he said, voice smooth, practiced. "Maeva, is it?" She swallowed. "Yes. How did you?" "News travels fast," he interrupted, the same words the innkeeper had used. He extended a gloved hand. "Elias Thornton. I run the town's clock shop." Maeva hesitated before shaking his hand. It was oddly warm, despite the chill in the air. "Nice to meet you." Elias tilted his head slightly, as though studying her. "You look unsettled." She forced a chuckle. "Just getting used to a new place. It's quiet here." "Yes," he said, and there was something strange in his tone. Not quite agreement, not quite amusement. Quiet indeed. Before she could respond, the clock tower at the heart of town chimed. A deep, resonant sound that seemed to shake the mist itself. Maeva glanced at her watch out of habit. It wasn't working. The hands had stopped at exactly 10:07. When she looked up, Elias was gone. A shiver ran down her spine. She turned back toward the lodge, suddenly eager to be indoors. But as she walked, the fog thickened, pressing in around her until she could barely see a few feet ahead. Her footsteps quickened. The streets twisted in unfamiliar ways. Was she going the wrong way? No, she had just come from here. And then she saw it. A figure standing in the fog, just ahead. Not moving, not breathing. Maeva stopped. The figure was barely more than a silhouette, but something about it made her stomach twist. She took a step back, and in that instant, the figure flickered, vanishing for half a heartbeat before reappearing closer. Maeva gasped, stumbling back. The figure didn't move, but its presence pushed against her like an unseen force. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The fog shifted, revealing the Holloway Lodge just ahead. Maeva nearly ran inside, slamming the door behind her. The innkeeper looked up from her desk, her expression unreadable. "You've seen them, haven't you?" she asked, voice low. Maeva's breath came in sharp gasps. "What was that?" The old woman sighed, rubbing her hands together as though trying to warm them. "The flickers," she murmured. "You best stay inside after dark, dear. The longer you're here, the more you'll notice. And the more they'll notice you." Chapter 3. Conversations that never happened. Maeva lay awake long after the innkeeper's cryptic warning, staring at the dark ceiling of her room. The encounter in the fog played over and over in her mind, each detail unraveling into new questions. The flickers, the way the figure had vanished, then reappeared closer, as if time had folded between them. It wasn't just a trick of the mist. Something was terribly wrong with this town. When sleep finally took her, it was restless. She dreamed of winding streets that looped endlessly, of clocks melting into puddles of shadow, of hands reaching from the fog to pluck moments from her mind. When she woke, the morning light was already seeping through the curtains, golden and warm. She sat up with a start. Her body felt heavy, like she had slept far too long. Fumbling for her phone, she squinted at the screen. 8:42 a.m. That wasn't right. She had set her alarm for 7 a.m. Maeva checked the bedside clock. It showed 7:11. She frowned, grabbed her wristwatch from the nightstand. 6:57. Something cold twisted in her stomach. 3 different times. She had overslept? Or had she? Throwing on a sweater, she hurried downstairs. The scent of coffee drifted through the air, but the lodge's small dining area was empty. No guests, no staff. A single steaming cup sat on the counter, as if prepared just for her. The innkeeper was nowhere in sight. A sharp tick, tick, tick filled the silence. Maeva turned toward the grandfather clock in the corner. Its pendulum swung in perfect rhythm, but the hands weren't moving. They trembled in place, twitching as though trapped in an invisible force. Then, with a sudden lurch, they jumped forward. 1 hour. The coffee cup shattered on the floor. Maeva hadn't touched it. A gasp caught in her throat. She spun toward the doorway just as the innkeeper appeared, her weathered face unreadable. "Don't fight it," the old woman said softly. "You can't hold on to lost time." Maeva swallowed, her voice hoarse. "What just happened?" The innkeeper sighed, kneeling to clean the spilled coffee. "The first time it happens, you feel it. After a while, you stop noticing." A chill crawled up Maeva's spine. Noticing what? The innkeeper looked up, her gaze heavy with something like pity. "The hours you lose." The words clung to Maeva as she stepped out into the town. The morning mist had burned away, leaving behind a deceptively peaceful atmosphere. Shops were open, people moved along the streets, their conversations drifting through the air. Yet Maeva felt detached from it all, as if she had missed something vital. She wandered toward the town square, past the clock shop where Elias Thornton stood in the doorway, watching her. She forced herself not to meet his gaze. Instead, she continued walking, her mind racing. The innkeeper's warning, the flickers in the fog, the stopped watches, and now this, time slipping through her fingers like sand. How long had it been happening? Was she losing time even now? She needed answers. Maeva quickened her pace toward the town library, its old stone structure standing solemnly at the edge of the square. If this place had secrets, they had to be written down somewhere. She pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped inside. Rows of bookshelves stretched before her, the scent of aged paper thick in the air. A single librarian sat behind the desk, an elderly woman with silver hair neatly pinned back. She looked up, eyes narrowing slightly. "New to town?" Maeva hesitated. "Yes, I'm looking for historical records. Anything on Timbrewood's past." The librarian studied her for a moment before nodding toward the back of the room. "Archives are there. But be mindful, miss." "Maeva." The woman smiled faintly. "Be mindful, Maeva. Some history is best left undisturbed." Maeva's pulse quickened as she stepped toward the archives. The room was dimly lit, dust motes swirling in the air. She ran her fingers along the spines of old ledgers and journals, pulling one free at random. As she flipped through the brittle pages, a phrase leapt out at her. Documented cases of temporal displacement. Individuals reported missing hours, days, memories erased, lives rewritten. A shadow flickered at the edge of her vision. Maeva turned sharply. The aisle was empty. Yet deep in her gut, she knew she wasn't alone. The hour she had lost this morning was only the beginning. Chapter 4. The Clockmaker's Warning. Maeva's fingers tightened around the brittle journal as she scanned the faded ink. The words swam before her eyes, whispering of things that should not be possible. Temporal displacement. Missing hours. Lives rewritten. The room felt colder now, as if the very walls carried the weight of forgotten time. A soft creak broke the silence. Maeva's breath hitched. She turned sharply, expecting to see another empty aisle. Instead, an elderly man stood at the far end of the archive room, half hidden in the shadows. His suit was outdated, his eyes heavy with an exhaustion that went beyond age. He studied her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "You shouldn't be reading that." His voice was hoarse, as if disuse had left it cracked and hollow. Maeva swallowed. "Who are you?" The man hesitated before stepping forward. His presence felt oddly displaced, like he didn't entirely belong to the moment. "I am someone who remembers too much," he murmured. "And soon, you will too." Maeva clutched the journal tighter. "What does that mean?" The man let out a weary sigh and gestured to the book in her hands. "They don't want you to know. They erase, they correct, they steal. Time isn't what you think it is." A chill swept through her. "Who are they?" The man's expression darkened. "The ones who make sure no one asks that question." The library's overhead lights flickered, buzzing like trapped insects. The air crackled with something unseen, an oppressive weight pressing down on Maeva's chest. The man took a step closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. You lost an hour this morning, didn't you? Maeva's pulse pounded. How do you? It won't be the last. The lights flickered again, longer this time. A shadow swept across the room, and for the briefest second, Maeva thought she saw figures standing behind the bookshelves, indistinct and watching. Then, just as quickly, they were gone. The old man's hand shot out, gripping her wrist. His skin was ice cold. They know you're looking now. That means they'll come for you. Maeva yanked her arm free. Who are you? She demanded. How do you know all this? He hesitated, then reached into the pocket of his tattered coat and pulled out a small, brass pocket watch. The glass was cracked, the hands frozen at an impossible hour, 13:01. He pressed it into her palm. I was like you once, he whispered, before they took me out of time. Maeva's stomach twisted. What does that mean? The man only shook his head. Leave Timbrewood before it's too late. A loud click echoed through the room as the overhead lights flared back to full brightness. The librarian's voice cut through the air. Is everything all right back here? Maeva turned toward the entrance. The librarian stood there, her sharp gaze sweeping the room. When Maeva turned back, the old man was gone. Her fingers curled around the broken pocket watch, its cold metal pressing into her palm. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears. Something was very, very wrong with this town. Chapter 5. Lost Hours, Lost Faces. Maeva stood at the foot of the winding path, her fingers curled tightly around the broken pocket watch. The old man's warning echoed in her mind, a whisper threading through the crisp evening air. She should have heeded his words. She should have left. Instead, she was here. The house loomed ahead, half swallowed by overgrown ivy and shadowed by ancient trees that seemed to whisper in the breeze. It stood apart from the rest of Timbrewood, distant and uninviting, perched at the very edge of town as though it had been exiled. Something about it called to her, a quiet insistence that pulled her forward despite the growing unease pooling in her gut. A single window on the upper floor flickered with movement. Someone, or something, was inside. Maeva forced herself up the creaking steps of the porch. The wood sagged under her weight, groaning in protest. The door, weathered and heavy, bore no visible lock, yet when she pressed her palm against it, it swung open without resistance, as if the house had been waiting for her all along. Inside, dust swirled in the dim light, caught in the hesitant glow of the late afternoon. The air smelled of age, of time left to rot in forgotten corners. The furniture, draped in sheets, stood like specters frozen in time, untouched by life. And then she heard it. Tick. A single, deliberate sound. It did not come from the pocket watch in her hand. Its hands remained broken, unmoving. No, this ticking came from somewhere deeper within the house, steady and rhythmic, a pulse in the silence. Maeva followed it, her steps slow, cautious. The corridor stretched ahead, impossibly long. Doors lined both sides, closed tight. The ticking grew louder, beckoning her toward the last door at the end of the hallway. She hesitated. Then, something shifted beneath her feet. The floorboards warped, subtly but unmistakably. It was as though the house itself was breathing, expanding and contracting in some unseen rhythm. A soft click came from the door ahead. The handle turned on its own. The door creaked open. Maeva's breath caught in her throat. Inside was a study, bookshelves crammed with leather-bound volumes, a mahogany desk cluttered with old papers. But it was what sat at the center of the room that sent a chill down her spine. A clock. Not just any clock. It stood tall, its frame carved from dark wood, its face cracked but still functional. The pendulum swayed, slow and deliberate. But what unsettled her most was that it had no numbers, only empty space where time should have been. Tick. The sound vibrated through her bones, deeper than it should have been, as though it was not just marking time, but taking it. A whisper slithered through the air behind her. You're not supposed to be here. Maeva spun, heart pounding. The room was empty. The ticking grew erratic, frantic. The walls seemed to tremble. She stumbled backward, her shoulder knocking into the clock. The moment her skin touched it, a violent jolt ran through her. A sensation like being plunged underwater, pressure building in her skull. Flashes of memories that weren't hers. Faces she didn't recognize. A town that flickered in and out of existence. And beneath it all, a single, terrible truth. This house was waiting because it remembered. With a strangled gasp, Maeva wrenched herself away. The clock's pendulum froze, the room falling into unnatural silence. And then, from somewhere deep in the house, a voice called her name. She ran. Chapter 6, The Whispering Elders. Maeva ran until the house was a distant, ghostly silhouette swallowed by the trees. The cold air burned her lungs, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The memory of the voice that had called her name clung to her like frost, tightening around her ribs, urging her forward. By the time she reached the outskirts of town, the fog had thickened. It curled around the buildings, turning their shapes into vague, shifting masses. Timbrewood felt altered somehow, distorted, like she had stepped into a different version of it. The town was never bustling, but now it was eerily quiet. No distant chatter, no footsteps crunching over gravel. Just the dense, suffocating silence of the mist. Maeva slowed her pace, her heartbeat still frantic in her ears. She wasn't alone. She felt it, the way a person senses unseen eyes on the back of their neck. Shadows moved within the fog, fleeting and uncertain. The town's outlines seemed to flicker, as if struggling to remain fixed in place. She turned a corner and stopped short. A figure stood at the end of the narrow street, barely visible through the shifting gray. It was tall, unmoving. "Hello." Maeva's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried, as if the fog itself was listening. The figure didn't respond. She stepped forward, cautiously. With each step, the details sharpened, the outline of a coat, the angle of a slightly bowed head. A man. Familiar, yet wrong. The old man from the shop. The one who had warned her. Mr. Calloway? He lifted his head. Maeva sucked in a breath. His eyes were vacant, not in the way of the absent-minded elderly, but in the way of something that had been hollowed out, emptied of its essence. His lips moved soundlessly at first, then he whispered, "They took it." Maeva took a step closer. Took what? His hands trembled, reaching for something invisible. Time. My memories. I had a daughter. Didn't I? His voice cracked, and Maeva's stomach twisted. She had no answer to give him. The weight of his confusion, his loss, pressed against her ribs like an iron cage. Then, his expression changed. A flicker of something deeper than recognition, something ancient and warning. His mouth opened, his voice raw with urgency. "They're coming." Maeva spun around, expecting to see someone or something emerging from the fog. But there was nothing. Only the mist, thickening, pulsing as though it had a heartbeat of its own. When she turned back to Calloway, he was gone. The fog swallowed everything. Buildings stretched and blurred, shifting in and out of focus. Maeva's pulse pounded as she backed away, her boots crunching against the damp ground. The silence had changed. It was no longer empty but full, brimming with something unseen and waiting. Then a sound, a whisper, threading through the mist. "Maeva." Her breath hitched. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a call for help. It was a knowing. She turned and ran. Chapter 7, A Fractured Reflection. Maeva ran until the town's warped, shifting outlines blurred past her, the cobblestones slick beneath her frantic steps. The mist clung to her skin, thick and unyielding, muffling the sound of her own breath. The moment she crossed the threshold of her rented cottage, she slammed the door shut behind her, pressing her back against it as if her weight alone could hold something at bay. Her lungs burned. Her hands trembled. Calloway's face haunted her mind. The empty eyes, the cracked voice, the way he reached for something long since stolen. "They took it. My time." Maeva squeezed her eyes shut. but it did nothing to dispel the whisper that had slithered through the fog. Her name, spoken not as a greeting nor a warning, but as a certainty. She forced herself to move, her fingers fumbling with the locks before she staggered toward the window. The town outside was smothered in the same dense mist, a ghostly veil draping over the streets. But something was different. The buildings seemed displaced, their shapes wavering in the haze, as if they were being rewritten by an unseen hand. Maeva's gaze darted to the clock on the wall. Midnight. She blinked. The second hand wasn't moving. A chill spread through her chest. She reached for her phone, checking the time. Midnight. It, too, was frozen. Her fingers trembled as she refreshed the screen, but nothing changed. A whisper of movement caught her attention. The reflection in the window shifted. Maeva spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The room behind her was unchanged, silent, untouched. But the feeling of being watched had returned, heavier than before. It was as if the very air had thickened, pressing down on her ribs, slowing her heartbeat to something sluggish and wrong. She turned back to the window. The mist swirled, revealing the street lamp outside. And beneath it, a figure stood motionless in the fog. Tall, unmoving, waiting. A jolt of fear lanced through her. Her first instinct was to retreat, but something about the figure held her in place. Not just fear, something deeper. Recognition. The silhouette shifted, and for a fleeting moment, the mist thinned just enough for Maeva to see a glimpse of a face. A face she knew. Hers. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her pulse hammering against her ribs. The version of herself outside did not move, did not blink. And then, slowly, so impossibly slow that Maeva nearly doubted it happened at all, the other her tilted its head, just slightly, just enough for a sensation of dread to crawl up Maeva's spine. The frozen clock ticked. Once, the moment shattered. The lights flickered. The weight in the air snapped like a taut wire. The reflection in the window was only her own again. The street lamp stood empty. The mist swallowed the world whole. The time on her phone remained unchanged. Maeva stumbled backward, her limbs unsteady, her thoughts spiraling. She had to leave, had to find someone, anyone, who could confirm that she hadn't imagined it. But something told her she was already too late. Time in Timbrewood had stopped, and she was the only one who knew. Chapter 8. The Missing Winter of 87. Maeva stood motionless in the heart of Timbrewood, the weight of time pressing down on her like a thick, invisible fog. The air seemed heavier here, as if reality itself had been stretched, its fibers pulled and twisted beyond recognition. She could feel it, the instability in every corner of this town. It wasn't just her memories that felt fragmented. Everything around her felt out of place, as though the world itself was fraying at the edges. She tried to recall when this sense of dissonance had started, but the memories came in jagged bursts, moments out of sequence, faces that seemed both familiar and strange, words spoken that she couldn't remember hearing. Maeva shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. It had all begun after that night, after she had been drawn into the strange labyrinth of the Chronophages world. But even that memory felt distant, like a dream that was fading faster than she could grasp it. She had learned more in the past few days than she could have ever imagined, about herself, about the Chronophages, about the true nature of time. The elders had carefully orchestrated her trauma to awaken something in her, something that, once unlocked, would bind her to their collective will. Maeva was no mere victim in this town. She was a cog in the machine, one that they had cultivated for years. But Maeva had never been one to follow. The more she uncovered about their motives, the more she felt her resolve harden. The Chronophages were not just taking time from the town. They were consuming it, erasing pieces of people's lives, distorting their very existence. Her heart ached for the residents of Timbrewood. They didn't know the truth. They couldn't. They lived in a bubble, unaware of how their time was being stolen from them. Maeva had seen it in their eyes. The vacant stares, the sudden shifts in their behavior, as if they were missing something crucial. And now, as she walked through the town square, she noticed another unsettling change. The clock tower stood at the center of the town, its hands ticking away with mechanical precision. But something was wrong. The shadows beneath the tower seemed to stretch unnaturally, shifting like they were alive, as if they were being pulled by unseen forces. Maeva approached cautiously, her steps hesitant, yet driven by a deep need to understand what was happening. As she drew closer, she saw something that made her stop dead in her tracks. A thin, golden thread hung from the clock's hands, shimmering faintly in the fading sunlight. Maeva reached out, her fingers brushing against it. The moment she touched it, the thread seemed to quiver, and a ripple of energy shot through her body, like a jolt of static electricity. The thread disappeared. She blinked, disoriented. Had she imagined it? She looked around, but the thread was gone, leaving no trace behind. Maeva felt a sense of unease settle deep in her chest. This was no ordinary thread. It felt personal, like something that had been tied to her. She had seen it before, somewhere in the corners of her mind, but she couldn't place where. A voice broke through her thoughts, low and smooth like honey, yet laced with something cold. "You feel it, don't you?" Maeva turned, her heart racing. Standing before her was Elias, one of the Chronophages. His face was serene, but his eyes gleamed with an unsettling knowledge. He had been watching her closely since she arrived in Timbrewood, ever since she had begun to uncover the truth. "What was that?" Maeva demanded, her voice sharp despite the tremor in her hands. Elias stepped closer, his presence unnerving in its calmness. "It's the thread of time," he explained, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "The Chronophages use it to weave the lives of the people here, to tie them into a delicate balance. The clock tower is a focal point for this thread, an anchor for the time we've stolen." Maeva recoiled, her mind racing. You're using it to control them. All of them. The people here, they don't even know." Elias' smile was faint, almost pitying. "Of course they don't. Why would they? Time is not something that can be understood by the average mind. It is too fragile, too elusive. We, the Chronophages, are the custodians of it. Without us, this town would fall apart." "Fall apart?" Maeva's voice shook with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You're tearing them apart. You're erasing their lives. We're giving them stability," Elias corrected, his tone calm, almost soothing. "Without us, they would cease to exist. Without the thread, there is no continuity, no meaning. Time is a fragile thing, Maeva. It must be carefully maintained." Maeva took a step back, her hands clenching into fists. "And what about me?" she asked, her voice quieter now, yet filled with a raw edge. "Why am I here? Why me?" Elias looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You're special, Maeva. You've always been special. Your trauma, your pain, it was the catalyst that awakened your abilities. You are tied to the thread, whether you like it or not. You've already begun to see the world through our eyes." "No," Maeva whispered, shaking her head. "No, I won't be part of this. I won't help you." Elias' gaze darkened, and for a moment, Maeva saw a flicker of something dangerous behind his calm facade. "You don't have a choice, Maeva," he said softly. "The thread is already in you. It's only a matter of time before you embrace it." Before she could respond, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Maeva standing alone beneath the tower. Her heart hammered in her chest as the last rays of sunlight disappeared, and the town of Timbrewood seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. She didn't know what was happening to her, but one thing was certain. The more she unraveled the truth, the more entangled she became in their web, and there was no going back. Chapter 9. Unraveling the Gaps. The night had fallen like a heavy curtain, blanketing the town of Timbrewood in an unnatural silence. Maeva stood at the edge of the town square, staring at the now darkened clock tower. The memory of Elias' words lingered like a ghost in her mind. The thread is already in you. She could feel it, a subtle pull at the edges of her consciousness, as if something was tugging at the very core of her being. It wasn't just the thread that she had touched earlier. It was the truth that was unraveling before her, the uncomfortable realization that her entire life had been woven into a fabric she didn't understand. Maeva clenched her fists, trying to steady herself, to fight the overwhelming sense of helplessness that surged within her. She could no longer ignore the weight of it all. She wasn't just a bystander in this town's twisted game. She was a participant, and there was no escaping the tangled web she was now a part of. The streets of Timbrewood were quiet, the occasional flicker of a light from behind closed windows the only indication of life. As Maeva walked through the empty streets, her footsteps echoed off the cobblestones, and with each step, the world around her seemed to blur and shift. Time felt elastic, stretching and snapping back in unpredictable ways. One moment, she was in front of a bakery with warm, inviting lights spilling from the windows. The next, she was standing in front of a house that seemed to have disappeared from the street entirely, its silhouette gone as if it had never existed. Her heart raced, the confusion deepening. What was happening to her? Why did the town feel as though it was slipping in and out of reality, like a faded photograph losing its clarity? Maeva's breath quickened, the sensation of being trapped in a shifting reality overwhelming her. She wanted answers, but each time she reached for them, they slipped just out of her grasp. Maeva. The voice was soft, yet it felt as though it had penetrated the very fabric of her thoughts. She spun around, heart thundering in her chest. Standing at the edge of the square, bathed in the dim glow of a street lamp, was Elias. His face was unreadable, but his eyes glinted with an unsettling intensity. "You've been busy," he said, his tone light, but carrying an edge of something far more serious. "I see you've noticed the changes." Maeva swallowed, taking a step back. "What's happening here?" Her voice cracked with the weight of the question, but she had to ask it. The air felt thick with the unknown, and the more she uncovered, the less she understood. Elias studied her with a quiet amusement. "You're beginning to feel it, aren't you? The ripple effect." "The ripple effect," Maeva repeated, trying to make sense of the words. "Yes, the thread. Maeva, it's not just a physical thing. It's more than that. When time is manipulated, when moments are stolen and replaced, there are consequences. Small changes that create a larger shift, like ripples in a pond. The more you pull at the thread, the more the fabric of reality itself begins to distort. And you, Maeva, are at the center of it all." The words landed heavily, each one adding weight to the suffocating confusion she already felt. Her stomach churned. She wasn't just a pawn in this sick game. She was the catalyst, the one who had the power to unravel the entire town's existence. Or worse, to see it fall apart completely. "I don't understand," Maeva whispered, her voice small despite her attempts to remain composed. Elias stepped closer, his expression softening as if he were explaining something to a child. "Time is not as linear as you might think. The past, the present, the future, they're all interconnected, and they all depend on the delicate balance we maintain. You, Maeva, have been given a gift. The ability to see through the cracks, to understand the way time weaves through us all." Maeva took a step back, shaking her head. "No, this isn't a gift. You're controlling it all. You're stealing people's memories, their lives." Elias smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "You misunderstand. We're not stealing, Maeva. We're preserving. We're saving them from the chaos that would otherwise consume them." "And what about me?" Maeva demanded, her anger rising despite the fear that gnawed at her. "What about what you've done to me? I don't want any part of your twisted preservation." Elias' gaze hardened, but his voice remained calm. "You don't get to choose, Maeva. Not anymore. The thread is in you, and now you must learn to wield it." The air between them crackled with a strange tension, and Maeva felt the overwhelming urge to flee, to escape this suffocating conversation, but she couldn't. The thread, whatever it was was pulling her deeper into the Chronophages' grip. She didn't know how to fight it, didn't know where to turn, and the more she struggled, the more she felt the fabric of her own existence tearing apart. "You'll learn soon enough," Elias continued, his voice soft and almost pitying. "Time has a way of forcing us to confront what we're trying to avoid." Before Maeva could respond, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the square. The town seemed to close in around her, and the unsettling sense of time warping and shifting only grew stronger. Every street, every building felt like it was on the edge of collapsing, as though the very foundation of Timbrewood was crumbling. As Maeva turned and walked away, her footsteps faltering, she couldn't help but feel that she was being drawn deeper into a web she had no way of escaping. The ripple effect had already begun, and there was no telling how far it would spread. But Maeva knew one thing for certain now. She was running out of time. Chapter 10: The House Without a History. Maeva's footsteps echoed through the narrow streets of Timbrewood, but the sound seemed muffled, as though the very air was holding its breath. The town had become a labyrinth in her mind, a twisted maze of blurred memories and fractured time. She couldn't shake the feeling that every corner she turned, every step she took, led her deeper into the heart of something darker, something she wasn't yet ready to understand. The silence around her felt unnatural, like the stillness before a storm. She had seen the way the town shifted, how the past seemed to bleed into the present, and how people, no, not just people, but entire moments, flickered in and out of existence. It was as if time itself was a living thing, breathing and pulsating, but it was dying, its rhythm distorted by the Chronophages' manipulation. Her thoughts returned to Elias, his calm, cold demeanor, his assurances that the thread was in her now, that she couldn't escape it. She still didn't understand what he meant, but one thing was becoming clearer with each passing day. She was more entwined in this town's strange web than she had ever imagined. The more she resisted, the more she felt the pull, an invisible tether that connected her to something far more sinister. She had to find out more. She had to understand what was really happening here, and why the Chronophages seemed so sure that time was their domain, their possession. Maeva's feet led her to the edge of the square, where the clock tower stood like a silent sentinel. It loomed above her, its clock hands unmoving, frozen in time. She had come to this place several times since she had arrived in Timbrewood, but tonight, something felt different. There was a hum in the air, a subtle vibration that seemed to reverberate through the ground beneath her. It was as if the very fabric of the town was alive with a silent pulse. Approaching cautiously, Maeva reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold stone of the tower. The touch sent a jolt through her, as if the clock had awakened at her contact. For a brief moment, the hands of the clock twitched, an imperceptible movement that made Maeva's breath catch in her throat. And then, she heard it, a faint sound, like the ticking of a clock, but deeper, more resonant, as though it came from within the tower itself. Maeva frowned, her heart racing as she stepped back. The sound grew louder, the ticking growing faster, more frantic, until it felt as though the town itself was ticking in time with her pulse. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but something rooted her to the spot. The sound, the ticking, it was pulling her in, drawing her closer to the tower. She had to know where it was coming from. She rounded the base of the tower and came to a small, hidden door. It was ancient, weathered, the wood chipped and worn with age, but there was something oddly inviting about it, as though it had been waiting for her. Maeva's hand trembled as she reached for the door, pushing it open with a creak that echoed through the silence. The room beyond was dark, its only light coming from the flickering shadows cast by the faint moonlight filtering through a small window. The ticking grew louder here, reverberating through the stone walls, until it felt like it was inside her head, inside her very bones. Maeva's breath quickened, her heart pounding against her ribs. She stepped further into the room, her eyes searching for the source of the sound. And then she saw it. At the far end of the room, nestled in a small alcove, was a massive, intricately carved clock. But this was no ordinary timepiece. It was ancient, older than anything Maeva had ever seen, its gears exposed, its hands still moving, slowly but steadily. The clock seemed to be alive, the ticking vibrating in the air like a heartbeat. Maeva approached cautiously, her eyes widening as she took in the details. The clock's face was covered in strange markings, symbols she couldn't comprehend. It wasn't just a clock, it was a map, a diagram of time itself, with lines and threads connecting each number in ways that made no sense. Her hand reached out, her fingers brushing against the surface of the clock. The moment she touched it, the room seemed to shudder, the ticking growing louder, faster, until it was deafening. Maeva stumbled back, her head spinning, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the clock. The hands were moving now, turning with unnatural speed, as though time itself were unraveling. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the ticking stopped. The room fell into complete silence, the air thick with tension. Maeva stood frozen, her mind racing. What had just happened? Had she triggered something? Was the clock alive? Was it? Before she could finish the thought, the door slammed shut behind her, plunging the room into darkness. Maeva's breath hitched as she spun around, her pulse hammering in her throat. There was no way out. She was trapped. The walls began to shift. Time, she realized with a sinking feeling, was no longer stable. The clock had done something to the very essence of the town, and now she was caught in its chaotic pulse. The room began to bend, the walls warping and twisting as though they were made of liquid. Maeva's legs felt weak beneath her, but she forced herself to move. She had to find a way out. She had to escape before the clock's power consumed her entirely. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that could help her, anything that could explain what was happening. And then, through the haze of shifting reality, Maeva saw something. A figure, standing at the far corner of the room, watching her. It was Elias. His eyes glinted in the darkness, a faint smile curling at his lips. "I see you've discovered the heart of it all," he said, his voice smooth, almost satisfied. "The clock is more than just a timepiece, Maeva. It's the heartbeat of this town, the center of the thread that binds us all together. And now, you've awakened it." Maeva's heart skipped a beat, panic rising in her chest. "What have you done to me?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Elias' smile deepened, and for the first time, she saw a glimmer of something darker in his eyes. "What I've done, Maeva, is give you the chance to truly see. You've always been connected to time. Now you're part of it, and you're the only one who can decide whether it will tear you apart or help you put it all back together." Maeva's mind spun, but she couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The clock's tick was returning, louder now, more insistent. And she realized, with horror, that the ticking wasn't just coming from the clock anymore. It was coming from her own heart. Chapter 11. The Library of Stolen Time. Maeva's chest heaved as she struggled to steady her breath, her mind whirling with the words Elias had left hanging in the air. The clock's incessant ticking echoed in her ears, growing louder with every heartbeat, as though time itself was tightening around her like an invisible noose. She reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing against the stone walls of the room, seeking something, anything, that could offer her an escape from the rising panic. But the room wasn't the same anymore. The walls were no longer solid, no longer anchored to reality. The edges of the room shimmered, fading in and out of focus, as if the very fabric of the space was unraveling before her eyes. Time had become malleable, distorted, and Maeva could feel it shifting beneath her feet, pulling at her consciousness like a tide that threatened to sweep her away. Elias remained in the far corner of the room, his presence unsettling in its stillness. He seemed unaffected by the chaos that was unfolding around them, as if he were immune to the disintegration of reality. Maeva wanted to scream, to demand answers, but her voice seemed to falter before it could leave her throat. "You've awakened it," Elias repeated, his voice calm and unwavering. "The clock, the thread, it's all connected. And now, the balance has shifted. It's up to you to restore it." Maeva's mind raced. Restore it? How was she supposed to restore something when she didn't even understand it in the first place? The clock, the chronophages, the strange distortions that plagued the town. Everything was slipping further into incomprehensible chaos, and Maeva felt as if she were drowning in it. "The thread," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What thread?" Elias stepped forward, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "The thread of time, Maeva. It's the essence that binds everything together. Every moment, every memory, every experience is tied to it. But the chronophages," he paused, his expression darkening. "They consume it. They feast on time itself, unraveling the fabric of reality in the process." Maeva's stomach churned. The thought of time being consumed, devoured like a meal, made her feel as though she were on the edge of something vast and unknowable. It felt like the world she had known was slipping away, leaving only fragments behind. "And what does this have to do with me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why am I?" "Because you are the key," Elias interrupted, his tone sharp, yet strangely gentle. "You are tied to the thread in ways you don't fully comprehend. The chronophages have manipulated your memories, your past, to awaken the latent power within you. You are connected to time itself, Maeva. You are one of them, whether you realize it or not." The weight of his words pressed down on her chest, suffocating her. She stumbled back, her hand gripping the edge of the clock for support. "No, I'm not one of them. I'm not like them." Elias regarded her with something like pity. "You say that now, but you'll understand in time. You must." He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "The chronophages are not your enemies, Maeva. They are the custodians, the keepers of time. They believe they are saving it. But they have grown greedy, and now they are consuming more than they should. The balance has been disrupted, and the thread is fraying. You are the only one who can mend it." Maeva shook her head, the confusion and dread threatening to overwhelm her. "I don't understand. I don't want to be part of this, part of them. I just want to leave. I want things to go back to normal." Elias' expression softened, but it was a sadness that weighed heavily on his features. "There is no going back, Maeva. The moment you touched the clock, the moment you allowed the thread to course through you, there was no going back. You are already part of it, part of the cycle." She turned away from him, her thoughts spiraling. Her life, her memories, everything had been turned upside down. There was no escape from this twisted reality, no easy way out of the web that had been spun around her. She had been unknowingly pulled into something far greater than she could have ever imagined. And now, the very fabric of existence was at risk. "What am I supposed to do?" Maeva's voice cracked as she spoke. "How do I fix this? How do I stop them?" Elias remained silent for a long moment, his gaze distant, as though contemplating the weight of her question. "The only way to restore balance," he said at last, "is to sever the thread. But be warned, Maeva, once the thread is severed, there will be no more time, no more memories. Everything you know will be erased. The chronophages will cease to exist, and the town will be nothing more than a distant echo." A shiver ran down Maeva's spine as the gravity of his words sank in. Sever the thread? Erase everything? Could she do that? Was she willing to pay such a steep price to restore balance? The thought of losing everything, of losing herself, terrified her. But the alternative, the chronophages continuing to consume time, warping reality, was equally unimaginable. Maeva turned to face him once more, her mind made up. "I have to stop them. I can't let this continue." Elias nodded solemnly. "Then you must find the heart of the thread. It lies deep within the town, hidden beneath the layers of time they've manipulated. The heart will lead you to the truth. And from there, you will have to decide, restore the balance or let time fall apart." The room around them seemed to tremble as he spoke, as though the very air were alive with the tension of unspoken possibilities. Maeva's heart pounded in her chest, and her pulse seemed to echo in the silence. This was the moment that would define everything. The moment when she would either save the town or let it disappear forever. She turned toward the door, her resolve hardening. There was no turning back now. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and uncertainty. But she had to see it through. For herself, for the town, for the thread that connected them all. As she stepped into the shifting darkness, Maeva knew one thing for certain. The clock was ticking, and it would never stop. Chapter 12. Echoes of the Vanished. Maeva's footsteps were heavy as she walked through the streets of Timbrewood. The town, once familiar and comforting, now seemed foreign, as though it were a half-remembered dream. Each turn, each corner, felt as though it could slip from her grasp, like sand running through her fingers. The air felt thicker than it had before, filled with the weight of time itself, as if the very fabric of reality had become tangled in the web of the Chronophages' manipulation. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to keep moving. Elias had told her to find the heart of the thread, to seek the source of the town's distorted time. And though the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty, Maeva had made her decision. She could no longer ignore the call that had been placed upon her shoulders. She was tied to this place, to this fate, whether she wanted to be or not. The town seemed eerily quiet now, as if even the wind dared not disturb the fragile balance of time that held it all together. The once bustling streets were empty, save for the occasional flicker of movement. Someone standing too still, too perfect, as though they were caught in a moment that didn't quite belong to them. Maeva passed the old, familiar buildings, but none of them felt the same. The bakery where she had once bought fresh bread, the town square where children had laughed and played, even the small library where she used to find solace. Everything seemed out of sync. Time had distorted them, stretched them, and in some cases, erased them altogether. A cold shiver ran down Maeva's spine as she continued down the winding road, her gaze scanning every inch of her surroundings. It was as if the town itself were holding its breath, waiting for something that was yet to come. The ground beneath her feet shifted slightly, the pavement warping and rippling as though it, too, was uncertain of what was real and what had been lost. The church bell in the distance tolled once, then twice, then stopped abruptly. Maeva paused, her heart skipping a beat. The sound of the bell was not natural. It was wrong, fractured, as though the bell had been struck in a place that didn't exist anymore. She quickened her pace, her fingers curling around the worn leather of the journal Elias had given her. She hadn't read much of it yet, but the passages within it were filled with cryptic hints about the heart of the thread, the place where time was anchored. Elias had told her to look for the old well, hidden deep in the forest that bordered the town. It was there that she would find what she needed to restore the balance. The forest was always an eerie place, full of shadows and secrets, but now it felt even more so. Maeva could sense the weight of the forest pressing in on her as she ventured deeper, the trees towering above her like silent sentinels, watching her every move. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, as though the forest itself was holding its breath in anticipation. As she reached the clearing, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The trees around her groaned as though they were alive, their branches shifting and creaking with an ancient energy. In the center of the clearing stood an old stone well, its surface covered in moss and vines. Maeva approached cautiously, her every instinct telling her that this was the place she had been searching for. The well seemed ordinary at first, but as Maeva peered into its depths, she realized there was something hidden beneath the surface. The water that once filled it had long since evaporated, but in its place was a swirling, dark mist that seemed to pulse with life. The heart of the thread was buried here. She could feel it deep in her bones. This was where time itself was anchored, where the chronophages had bound everything together, and where they had begun to unravel it all. Maeva knelt at the edge of the well, her hands trembling as she reached for the mist. It curled around her fingers, cold and ancient, as though it were alive. She could feel the pulse of time within it, the beating rhythm of countless moments, each one slipping away and fading into nothing. The mist began to shift, pulling her deeper into the well's depths, and Maeva was overcome by a sudden, overwhelming sensation. Memories flooded her mind, memories that weren't her own, but seemed to belong to someone else. Faces she had never seen, places she had never been, all rushing toward her like a tidal wave. She could hear the voices of the chronophages, murmuring to her from the shadows, urging her to embrace her destiny, to take the power that was rightfully hers. But Maeva fought against it, her breath quickening as she pulled her hand back from the mist. She had to remain focused. The chronophages had tried to manipulate her, to make her believe that she was one of them. But she was not. She could not be. With a sudden burst of resolve, Maeva reached into the heart of the well, her fingers brushing against something solid beneath the mist. The moment her skin made contact, the ground beneath her feet trembled violently, and the air around her grew thick with energy. The heart of time was awakening, and with it came a terrible, overwhelming force. A sharp cry echoed through the forest, and Maeva felt her body being pulled downward, her grip slipping from the well's edge. The world around her spun in a dizzying blur, the lines between reality and illusion blurring into a chaotic whirlpool of sound and light. For a moment, she was weightless, lost in the vast expanse of time itself. And then, everything stopped. Maeva found herself standing in an endless void, surrounded by nothingness. The heart of the thread beat steadily in the distance, its pulse the only sound in the vast silence. She knew that the moment had arrived, the moment when she would either sever the thread and let time collapse, or restore the balance and save everything she knew. But as she stood there, staring into the void, she couldn't help but wonder, what would happen to her once the thread was severed? Would she be able to return to the world she knew, or would she be lost forever in the endless expanse of time? The choice was hers, but as Maeva took a step forward, she knew that whatever came next, there would be no turning back. Chapter 13, Maeva's Fractured Past. Maeva stood in the endless void, her heart racing in her chest as she tried to grasp the enormity of the moment. Time, in all its complexity, stretched out before her, an infinite expanse of possibilities, and yet, she could feel the weight of every decision hanging on her every breath. The pulse of the heart of the thread echoed in the void, steady and unyielding. It was the only constant in this place of absolute silence. She took a tentative step forward, the sound of her boots striking nothing but emptiness. There was no ground beneath her feet, no horizon to guide her, only the oppressive silence and the rhythm of the pulse. The darkness around her was suffocating, yet strangely serene, as though the entire universe was waiting for her to make her choice. Maeva had never felt so alone, yet she wasn't entirely sure she had ever been alone at all. Was it possible to truly be alone in a world where time was fluid, where memories and moments could be taken and erased? It felt as though she were standing on the edge of some ancient precipice, her fate intertwined with something far beyond her comprehension. The chronophages, the elders who had once seemed so distant, now felt like phantoms lurking just beyond her reach, watching her every move, guiding her towards something unknowable. She swallowed, her throat dry as dust. Her fingers trembled at her sides. The mist of the well had been a portal, a window to something far greater than the town of Timbrewood. But now, it was gone, and all that remained was the weight of what she had discovered. Time, Maeva realized, was not merely a force to be manipulated. It was alive, and it demanded balance. The thought of the chronophages, the ancient beings who had fed off the essence of time, stealing memories, erasing lives, made Maeva's blood run cold. They had taken so much. They had destroyed so much. But in the face of their insidious control, Maeva knew that the answer wasn't to destroy time itself. It wasn't to let the darkness swallow everything. Her hand tightened into a fist. She wouldn't let them win. She wouldn't let them erase the town, the people, the memories that had once been whole and unbroken. And she certainly wouldn't allow herself to become one of them. The heart of time pulsed again, its beat louder now, more insistent. Maeva could feel the pressure building around her, as though the very air itself were thickening with the weight of inevitability. She glanced downward, her eyes narrowing as she saw something shifting at the edges of her vision. A faint, shimmering light, like a distant star in the vast darkness. Without thinking, she moved toward it, her every step pushing against the unseen force that tried to hold her back. The light grew brighter the closer she came, until it surrounded her completely, bathing her in a soft, golden glow. In that light, Maeva saw something familiar, a vision, a memory. It was of Timbrewood. She was standing in the town square, the place where she had arrived only a few weeks ago, so certain that this was just another chapter in her life. There was a chill in the air, but it wasn't the biting cold of the forest. This was different, a crisp, familiar winter evening. The sound of the church bell rang out from a distance, the familiar chime that always seemed to mark the passage of time. But this memory felt wrong. The faces of the townspeople were blurred, their expressions vague and shifting, like reflections in water. They spoke to each other, their words falling like raindrops, but none of it made sense. Their voices overlapped, as though they were speaking in multiple layers, distorting everything around her. Maeva's breath caught in her throat. It was as if she had stepped into the middle of a conversation she didn't belong to, a moment that was meant for someone else. She wanted to reach out, to touch the figures that surrounded her, but as her fingers brushed against the air, the scene flickered, like a broken film reel, and the town square vanished before her eyes. For a moment, everything was dark again, and then it was gone. The next memory she found herself in was even more disorienting. She was standing in the forest, where she had last encountered the well. But this time, there was something different, something more visceral. The trees were alive with movement, their branches swaying as if alive, casting long, skeletal shadows across the ground. There was a sharp, unnatural chill in the air, and as Maeva breathed in, the scent of the earth was thick with decay, as if something ancient and forgotten had awoken. She heard the sound of something crashing through the brush, something heavy, something that shouldn't have been there. Maeva turned just in time to see a figure emerge from the shadows. Her heart skipped a beat. It was one of the Chronophages, a shadowy silhouette standing just beyond the reach of the light. Its form was barely discernible, flickering in and out of focus as though it were both here and not here at all. Its eyes glowed faintly, two pale orbs that seemed to pierce the very fabric of the world around them. "Maeva," the figure whispered, its voice rasping and hollow, as though it were made of smoke. "You have been chosen." The words struck Maeva like a bolt of lightning, her body freezing in place. She wanted to run, to escape, but her feet wouldn't move. The Chronophage's voice, like the toll of a distant bell, echoed in her ears, filling her mind with 100 different images, 100 different lives, each one flickering out of existence like a candle flame blown out in the wind. "You cannot escape what you are," the figure continued, its voice carrying the weight of 1,000 lifetimes. "Time is not a gift. It is a cycle, a never-ending loop. We are the guardians. We are the stewards of the thread." Maeva felt the words ripple through her, distorting her sense of self. She wanted to resist, to break free from the invisible chains that bound her. But she knew, deep down, that the figure was right. She was tied to this cycle. She was connected to the Chronophages in a way that could never be undone. "You must choose," the figure said, its eyes narrowing. "Join us, and embrace your destiny, or deny the thread and watch everything unravel. Maeva's breath quickened. The weight of the decision pressed down on her like 1,000 stones. She had always known that there was no easy answer, no way out of this web. But what if this was her fate? What if this was the only way to save what remained of the town, of the people she had come to care for? The chronophage stepped closer, its form flickering as though it were dissolving into the fabric of time itself. Maeva felt the cold air grow even colder, the tension thickening around her like a storm about to break. She had to make her choice. Chapter 14. The Chronophage's Invitation. The silence was deafening. Maeva stood at the crossroads of her own existence, the weight of the Chronophage's words lingering in the air like a heavy fog. Her pulse thudded in her ears, and the world around her seemed to pulse in time with it. Slow, steady, inevitable. Choose. The Chronophage whispered, its voice cold and hollow, as though it were coming from the depths of some forgotten cavern. Join us and become a part of the thread, or defy it and witness the unraveling of everything. The figure loomed before her, the flickering shadows of its form dancing in and out of her vision. Its pale eyes glowed with an unsettling light, their gaze penetrating and omniscient. Maeva's throat tightened, but she forced herself to stand her ground. The world felt distorted, as if the fabric of time itself was stretching and warping around her, teasing the boundaries of her understanding. She had no answers. There was no certainty in this place, no guide to lead her. Every choice she made seemed to lead her deeper into the unknown, deeper into the heart of the Chronophage's dark grip. But she refused to be a pawn in their game. She had already seen enough to know that their existence was founded on lies, on manipulation, and on the consumption of time itself. They did not deserve to control it. Yet, what was the alternative? The Chronophage's words gnawed at her mind. The concept of time was not something she had ever truly understood, but now it seemed to be the very fabric of her being, weaving the threads of every life, every moment, into a delicate and fragile tapestry. I am not like you, Maeva said, her voice trembling but firm. I will never be one of you. The Chronophage tilted its head, the flickering of its form slowing for a moment. Its lips curled into something akin to a smile, though it was far from comforting. You believe you can defy fate? It asked, the air growing colder with each word. You are already one of us. You have always been. Maeva swallowed hard. The words were like ice, cutting into her soul. Could it be true? Could she really be one of them? A creature born of the very thing she loathed? Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, and for a moment, the space around her seemed to vibrate, the pulse of time growing louder, more erratic. No, she said again, her voice stronger this time. I will not be your puppet. The figure did not respond immediately, but Maeva could feel the weight of its presence pressing in on her, its influence trying to worm its way into her thoughts. The very air seemed to thicken, heavy with the strange gravity of time itself. You are not alone in this. The Chronophage finally spoke. There are others, those who have come before you, those who have chosen to embrace the thread. You are not the first to stand at this crossroads, and you will not be the last. Maeva's heart raced. What did it mean? She had never known anyone else like her, no one who could feel the dissonance of time slipping through their fingers. But then, the Chronophages were not ordinary beings, were they? They had existed for longer than she could comprehend. The thought of other people, other souls, who had fallen into their grasp sent a shiver down her spine. If I refuse? Maeva asked, her voice shaking with uncertainty, but still holding a glimmer of defiance. What happens then? The figure remained silent for a moment, its glowing eyes never leaving hers. The longer Maeva stared into them, the more she felt as if she were being drawn into a deep abyss, one that was both terrifying and alluring. The Chronophage's answer came at last, soft but full of dread. Time will unravel. The thread will break, and you will watch it all fade away. You will lose the people you cherish, the moments that matter most. And then, you will be left with nothing but the endless, aching void of eternity. The darkness that surrounded them deepened, and for a split second, Maeva could see it, the future that could be. A world without time, without memory, where everything and everyone she had ever known would cease to exist. It was a terrifying thought, one that made her blood run cold. But there was something else there, too. Something hidden beneath the surface, a spark of hope that refused to be extinguished. "I can't let that happen," Maeva whispered, more to herself than to the chronophage. "I won't let it." The chronophage's gaze shifted, its form momentarily flickering as though it were unsure how to respond. Maeva took a deep breath, steadying herself. The pulse of time throbbed around her, a constant reminder that every moment was slipping away, but she knew what she had to do. She turned away from the chronophage, her resolve hardening. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing. She was not going to give in. She had seen too much, learned too much about the price the chronophages had paid to control time. She could feel the weight of their influence pulling at her, urging her to submit, to join them in their eternal existence. But she couldn't. She wouldn't. Instead, Maeva took another step forward, breaking through the web of darkness that surrounded her. The air felt lighter, the pulse of time growing quieter, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She didn't know where she was going, but she had to keep moving. The chronophage's voice, once commanding, now trembled with a hint of something darker, something more desperate. "You cannot escape the thread, Maeva. It will always find you." But Maeva didn't stop. She couldn't stop. As she moved, the world around her began to shift, the shadows folding away like tattered curtains, revealing glimpses of a different reality. There, in the distance, Maeva could see the town of Timbrewood again, its outlines blurred by time's distortion. The people were there, too. Faces she recognized, familiar voices she had once heard, but they were fading, their forms dissolving like smoke in the wind. "Maeva!" A voice called out, distant but unmistakable. It was a voice she knew well. It was the voice of someone she had loved, someone she had fought for. James. She had no time to lose. Chapter 15, Where the Hours Go to Die. The world shifted again, and Maeva found herself standing at the edge of the town she had once known, the cold wind of Timbrewood biting at her skin. She blinked, the scene in front of her growing more and more indistinct as time itself seemed to flicker and fade around her like a dying ember. The distant outlines of the houses, shrouded in the kind of haze that clung to memories, blurred, their shapes warping and melting into the backdrop of an uncertain reality. The sounds of the town, once so familiar to her, faded into a dull hum, like the echo of a long-forgotten song. The voices that had once filled the streets seemed distant, muted, as if they were being carried away by some invisible force. And in the distance, the everwood wishing tree stood still, its massive branches bending beneath the weight of ages, casting long shadows over the empty streets. Maeva's heart twisted. It was as if she had arrived in a dream, a place that was no longer quite real, where nothing could hold its shape for long enough to be tangible. The town was a memory, a mirage that was slipping further away from her with every passing moment. She reached out, her fingers brushing the air, but there was nothing there to hold on to. It was as if the fabric of everything she had known was unraveling in her hands. "James," she called out, her voice trembling, though she wasn't sure who she was calling to. He had been there. He had to be there. The faint flicker of his presence still lingered somewhere deep inside her, hidden beneath the layers of time that had been stolen from them both. But now, even that connection seemed distant. The silence pressed in, suffocating. It was more than the absence of sound. It was the absence of everything she had once believed to be real. Maeva took a step forward, her boots crunching on the frozen ground, the echo of her footsteps ringing hollow in the empty street. She couldn't remember how long she had been walking like this, lost, adrift, but it felt like an eternity. Time was slipping through her grasp again, fading from the edges of her memory, slipping into that gaping void that the chronophages had so callously manipulated. The wishing tree loomed ahead, its great branches twisted and gnarled, as if they had witnessed the passage of countless years, bearing witness to the desires and regrets of those who had come before. It was a symbol of hope, and yet, in Maeva's heart, it had become something else entirely. A reminder of everything she had lost, of everything that had been stolen from her. She stopped before it, her breath fogging the air as she stared up at its towering form. The tree seemed to pulse with a strange, almost sorrowful energy, as if it too could feel the weight of the fractured world around it. "You're still here," Maeva whispered, as though speaking to the tree, or perhaps to the memories that clung to her. The words were barely audible, swallowed by the cold wind, but she felt them reverberate deep within her chest. "You've always been here, haven't you?" The tree did not answer, but something stirred within its massive trunk, a soft vibration, like the hum of a distant song. Maeva reached out, her hand brushing against the rough bark, and for the briefest moment, she thought she felt something, a pulse of warmth, a flicker of recognition. She closed her eyes and let herself sink into the sensation. For a heartbeat, it was as if the tree was not just a tree. It was a part of her, a part of all the people who had ever stood beneath its branches, made their wishes, and prayed for answers. And it was as though the very essence of time itself had come alive within its roots. She could hear the whispers then, soft voices, fragmented and distorted by the passing years, reaching out to her from beyond the veil. Faint echoes of those who had once stood where she now stood. And in the distance, she could hear a name. Maeva. Her eyes snapped open, and she gasped. The voice was unmistakable. It was James. His presence, a flicker of warmth in the cold wasteland of time, came alive within her. The bond they had shared, the one that had been severed by the chronophages, pulsed through her like a beacon. She had felt it before, but now it was stronger, clearer. "James!" Maeva called out again, her voice growing louder, though still unsure of where he was or how she could reach him. The wind carried the sound of her words away, as though the very atmosphere itself was conspiring to drown her out. But she didn't care. She couldn't care. All that mattered was that she had found him, or at least part of him. She started walking again, her feet carrying her forward, deeper into the heart of the town. The buildings seemed to loom around her like silent sentinels, their empty windows staring out into the void. It was as if the entire town had been abandoned, erased from existence by some unseen hand. But Maeva wouldn't stop. She couldn't stop. Each step was an act of defiance against the chronophages. Each breath she took was a testament to the fact that time, though fragile, was still hers to command. They could manipulate the flow of it, steal it, consume it, but they could never fully control it. Not as long as she was still here. Not as long as she still remembered. As she continued, her mind raced with the weight of everything she had learned, about the chronophages, about herself, and about the impossible choices that lay before her. But one thing stood out above all else. She was not alone. James was still with her, even if only in spirit. And together, they could fight back. Chapter 16, The Ritual of Consumption. Maeva stood alone in the heart of Timbrewood, surrounded by shadows that stretched long and cold beneath the weight of the dying light. The town, once so alive with memory, now felt like a place abandoned to time itself. Each step she took echoed in the emptiness, reverberating off the walls of what had once been the homes of people who were no longer there. The landscape had become alien to her, as though every detail had been wiped clean, like a slate meant to be rewritten, but the words had yet to be spoken. It had been hours, maybe longer, since she'd stood beneath the everwood wishing tree, the faint stirrings of something lost calling to her from the depths of the earth. Her mind felt fragmented, the lines between past and present blurring like a fading dream. She tried to hold on to the connection she had felt, that fleeting moment of warmth when the voice of James had called her name, but it was slipping through her fingers like sand, the harder she tried to grasp it. Her hands trembled as she reached up to touch her temples, willing herself to remember the fragments of time that had been stolen from her and from all those around her, not at her. Every broken memory, every lost moment, felt like a weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. How many people had been consumed by the chronophages? How many lives had been erased, swept away into the void of stolen time? She could feel the heaviness of it all in her bones. Her journey had led her to this moment, to the heart of the town and to the wishing tree, but Mavis still didn't know how to stop the unstoppable, how to undo the damage that had already been done. The chronophages were watching, lurking in the shadows, and they were getting closer. She could feel their eyes on her, though she couldn't see them. They had no form, no shape, but their presence was undeniable. They were a force that moved through the cracks in reality, like a storm on the horizon, impossible to escape. And yet, Maeva couldn't help but feel the pull of something deeper. There was a whisper, faint at first, but growing stronger with each passing moment. It was the pull of the past, the pull of everything that had been lost. Every flicker of a forgotten moment, every piece of time that had been erased, was coming back, seeking to restore itself. The air around her grew heavy, as though the weight of all the lost moments was pressing in on her from every direction. Maeva had to find a way to stop it, to stop the chronophages and their insidious manipulation of time before they could erase everything. But how could she fight something so intangible? How could she fight time itself? A soft, almost imperceptible sound broke through the silence. It was the rustle of leaves, faint, like the brushing of silk against skin. Maeva froze. She wasn't alone. She could feel it now, the presence of someone or something moving through the space around her. She spun around, her breath coming in shallow gasps, but there was no one there. No figure, no shadow, just the empty streets of Timbrewood stretching out before her like a sea of forgotten memories. And then, just as quickly as the feeling had come, it faded. The world returned to its eerie stillness, as though the moment had never happened. Maeva's pulse raced, her eyes darting over the landscape in search of something. Anything that might explain what she had just felt. But there was nothing. The town was still, the air thick with the scent of decay and lost hope. She was alone. For a moment, she allowed herself to sink into the weight of her own thoughts, the crushing burden of all she had seen, all she had learned. She could feel the darkness creeping in at the edges of her mind, the overwhelming sense that time was slipping away faster than she could keep up with. But she couldn't stop now. She couldn't give in to the fear that was gnawing at her. James's voice still echoed in her ears, faint but persistent. She couldn't lose him. She couldn't let the chronophages win. Her eyes hardened with resolve. She would find a way to stop them, no matter the cost. The wind picked up, swirling around her like a storm in the distance. It carried with it the scent of pine and damp earth, a reminder of the town's natural beauty, now dulled by the weight of time. She could feel the energy of the place shifting beneath her feet, as if the very earth itself was alive, watching her, waiting for her to make her next move. Maeva's hand went instinctively to the pendant around her neck, the one she had found buried deep within her memories. It was the only thing left from her past, from the time before the chronophages had stolen it all. It was her anchor, her connection to everything she had lost. She clutched it tightly, feeling its cold surface against her skin, a small but constant reminder of who she was, and of the fight she still had ahead of her. With one final glance at the fading town around her, Maeva turned and began walking again, her footsteps firm and purposeful. She wasn't sure where she was going or what she would find, but she knew she couldn't stay here. Not when there was still so much at stake. Timbrewood may have been lost, but she wasn't. and as long as she still had breath in her body, she would fight to take back what had been stolen from her. Chapter 17. The Taste of a Stolen Life. Maeva's footsteps faltered as she approached the edge of the town. The air had grown thick with an unsettling stillness, the kind of quiet that felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. The streets, once familiar, now felt like a distant memory, like fragments of a world that no longer belonged to her. She paused, standing at the cusp of the unknown, the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest. The further she ventured into Timbrewood, the more fragmented her thoughts became. Every step seemed to peel back layers of the past, revealing moments she had long since buried beneath the sands of time. The faces of people she didn't remember, whispers of voices she had never heard. It was all becoming too much to bear. The more she tried to hold on to the threads of her own reality, the more they unraveled, slipping away like smoke through her fingers. Maeva closed her eyes, trying to focus, trying to make sense of the chaos that was swirling in her mind. She had to stay grounded, had to hold on to who she was. The Chronophages were closing in, their presence like a shadow that grew longer with each passing moment. She could feel their pull, their insidious grip on the fabric of time, and it was only a matter of time before they came for her, before they tried to erase her completely. But she couldn't let that happen. She had come too far. Opening her eyes, Maeva turned her gaze to the horizon, where the town's outlines blurred and faded into the mist. It was strange how the familiar could become so alien, how the place she had once called home now seemed so foreign. There was a sense of emptiness that clung to the air, a void that could never be filled. And it was then that Maeva understood. It wasn't just the town that was fading, but everything that had come before it. All the memories, all the experiences that had shaped her, were slipping away as if they had never existed. The sound of a distant clock tower chiming broke the silence, its deep toll sending a ripple through the stillness. Maeva's heart skipped a beat. The clock tower had always been a symbol of time, a reminder of the passage of moments. But now, it felt like a mockery, a cruel echo of something that no longer held meaning. She began walking again, her legs heavy with the burden of the memories that clung to her like shadows. With each step, the world around her seemed to blur, the lines between past and present becoming more indistinct. She could feel the weight of the Chronophages' influence, like an invisible force pressing against her chest, threatening to crush her. It was as if the very fabric of time was warping around her, distorting her sense of reality. As she neared the edge of the town, Maeva's mind flashed back to the night she had first arrived in Timbrewood. It had been a different place then, full of life and possibility. The town had been vibrant, alive with the echoes of its past. But now, it was as if the town itself had been erased, its memory stolen by the Chronophages. And that's when she realized the truth. The Chronophages didn't just steal time, they erased it. They didn't just manipulate the past, they consumed it, leaving behind only echoes. These echoes were the remnants of everything that had been lost, the forgotten moments that had been swallowed by the passage of time. The realization hit Maeva like a wave, crashing over her with a force that took her breath away. She wasn't just fighting to save herself. She was fighting to save everything that had been lost. Every moment, every memory, every experience that had been erased by the Chronophages. It was all hanging in the balance. She had to stop them. The thought was a burning fire in her chest, a fire that refused to be extinguished. The Chronophages may have taken time from her, may have tried to erase her past, but they couldn't take away her will. They couldn't take away her fight. Maeva clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. The echoes of the forgotten whispered in her ears, their voices calling to her from the void. They were trapped, just as she had been, lost in the gaps between moments. But Maeva knew something they didn't. She still had the power to change things. The Chronophages had underestimated her. They had underestimated the strength that came from the will to fight for what was rightfully hers. She had seen too much to turn back now. The clock tower chimed again, its sound more insistent this time, as if urging her forward. Maeva didn't hesitate. She could feel the pull of the past, feel the weight of the memories that had been stolen from her, and she knew she had to face the chronophages, had to confront them if she wanted to stop the cycle of erasure. With a final glance at the fading town behind her, Maeva set her eyes on the horizon. The road ahead was uncertain, the path fraught with danger, but she knew one thing: she wasn't alone. The echoes of the forgotten were with her, guiding her, reminding her of the strength that lay within her. Maeva stepped forward, her heart steady, her resolve unwavering. She would not let the chronophages win. She would not let them erase her or anyone else from existence. Chapter 18: The Keeper of Forgotten Moments. Maeva's breath came in shallow bursts as she ventured deeper into the forest surrounding Timbrewood. The air was thick with a tangible weight, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She could feel the presence of the chronophages lingering at the edges of her awareness, their influence growing stronger with each passing second. They were close now, closer than they had ever been. The trees, their trunks twisted and gnarled, seemed to close in around her, casting long shadows that stretched out like fingers. The path ahead was barely visible, swallowed by the dense undergrowth. Yet Maeva moved forward, her footsteps sure despite the encroaching darkness. It wasn't just the forest that felt different. It was the very air itself. The closer she came to the heart of the woods, the more the world seemed to shift around her. Time itself felt unstable. Moments blurred together, and the past and present seemed to tangle in ways that defied logic. Maeva had felt it before, the unsettling sensation of reality bending, of memories flickering in and out like a malfunctioning film reel. She clutched the locket around her neck, its cool surface a reminder of everything she had lost and everything she still had to fight for. The chronophages had taken so much from her already, but she wouldn't let them take any more. She couldn't afford to, not when the stakes were this high. The path led her to a clearing, the heart of the forest, where an ancient stone structure stood, an hourglass, its sands frozen in time. The air around it hummed with an eerie energy, a palpable force that seemed to distort the very fabric of reality. The structure was unlike anything Maeva had ever seen, its towering form impossibly intricate, its sides adorned with cryptic symbols and markings that seemed to shift as she stared at them. Maeva stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. The chronophages had brought her here, though she wasn't sure why. They had known she would find it, had known she would come to this moment. She had always felt that her connection to the chronophages was more than mere coincidence. But standing before the hourglass now, Maeva realized the truth. This was the source of their power. The heart of the hourglass held the secret to everything. The chronophage's ability to steal time, to manipulate memories, to erase existence itself. Her hands trembled as she reached out, touching the cold stone. The moment her fingers made contact, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. The air grew heavy, thick with an otherworldly pressure. And then, the sands of the hourglass began to move. It wasn't gradual. The sands poured down in a cascade of shimmering dust, flowing in reverse, climbing up the sides of the hourglass as though time itself were being rewound. The symbols on the stone flickered to life, glowing with an ethereal light. Maeva stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The hourglass was no longer just a relic. It was a conduit, a gateway to a place beyond time, a place where memories could be unmade, where time could be rewritten. Maeva's mind raced, her thoughts scrambling to make sense of the impossible. The chronophages had used this to steal time, to erase people from existence, to bend the very rules of reality to their will. But Maeva couldn't let them keep control. Not anymore. With a sudden surge of determination, Maeva stepped forward again, her hands steady as she grasped the base of the hourglass. She could feel its power coursing through her, the pull of the sands urging her to give in, to allow the chronophages to claim her as they had claimed so many before. But Maeva fought against it, the fire within her burning brighter than the pull of the hourglass. She could hear their voices now, the chronophages whispering in her ears, urging her to surrender. They told her that there was no escape, that time was inevitable, that her fate was already written. But Maeva knew better. She had seen the truth. The chronophages were not masters of time. They were prisoners of it, slaves to their own need for control. She could feel the hourglass trembling in her hands, its power fighting to break free. The sands flowed faster, swirling around her like a vortex. Maeva closed her eyes, drawing on the strength she had found within herself over the past weeks. The strength to resist, to fight, to reclaim what had been stolen. She whispered the words she had never spoken aloud, the words that had been buried deep within her heart. I will not let you win. I will not let you erase me. The moment she spoke those words, a surge of energy exploded from the hourglass, sending Maeva sprawling backward. The world around her seemed to fracture, reality splintering into jagged shards. The chronophages' whispers grew louder, their voices rising to a deafening crescendo. The pressure on her chest was unbearable, as if the weight of time itself were collapsing in on her. But Maeva held on. She had come too far to back down now. She rose to her feet, her hands still gripping the base of the hourglass. The sands had stopped flowing, frozen in place, their movement halted by her will. And in that moment, Maeva understood. The hourglass was not just a tool of the chronophages. It was a symbol of the power she held within herself, the power to defy the passage of time, to rewrite the rules of reality. Maeva took a deep breath, steadying herself as she focused on the hourglass. She could feel the energy within it, the raw, untamed power of time itself. It was hers to control now. She closed her eyes, focusing on the task at hand. The chronophages had underestimated her, had underestimated the strength of her will. And now, she was going to show them just how wrong they were. With a final surge of energy, Maeva unleashed her power, shattering the hourglass in a burst of light. Chapter 19. The Price of Reclaiming Time. Maeva stood amidst the ruins of the shattered hourglass, her breath still catching in her throat. The world around her felt as if it were suspended in time, frozen in the aftermath of her actions. The air was thick with the power of the moment, heavy with the force of the decision she had just made. The chronophages, their once unwavering presence, seemed distant now, as if their hold on the world had faltered. The sands, once flowing endlessly, were now scattered across the forest floor, glittering like the remnants of a forgotten dream. The symbol of their control, their dominion over time, lay broken at her feet. Maeva couldn't help but stare at the shattered pieces of the hourglass, her mind spinning with the enormity of what had just occurred. The chronophages were no longer the masters of time. They had been unseated, their power extinguished, but the cost of this victory was yet to be seen. She could feel the weight of the consequences pressing down on her, the magnitude of the change she had set in motion. Time, once a force that could be manipulated at will, was now beyond her control. The rules had shifted, and Maeva wasn't sure what would happen next. The forest around her had fallen silent, the distant sounds of nature muffled by the strange stillness that had overtaken the world. It was as if time itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what Maeva would do next. She closed her eyes, letting the quiet settle over her, and took a slow, steadying breath. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let the fear take hold. She had faced so much in this strange, shifting town, so much that had tested her, broken her, and made her question who she was. But now, standing here in the aftermath of her confrontation with the chronophages, she realized that she had reclaimed something far more valuable than time. She had reclaimed her own will. Maeva opened her eyes and looked around, her gaze shifting to the flickering remnants of the world she had known. Time, once a linear progression, had become something more fluid, something less certain. The gaps, the moments that had slipped through her fingers, were no longer as clear as they once had been. Everything around her was distorted, a mixture of past and present, future and now. The very fabric of reality was stretched thin, and Maeva could feel the weight of it pressing in from all sides. But despite the uncertainty, there was a strange sense of peace that had settled in her chest. She had broken free from the chains that had bound her. She was no longer a victim of the Chronophages, no longer a pawn in their twisted game of time manipulation. She had taken control, even if she didn't fully understand the consequences of that control. Maeva stepped forward, her eyes scanning the forest around her. She could sense the lingering presence of the Chronophages, still somewhere in the distance, but their influence was fading. They were no longer the unseen masters pulling the strings. They were simply shadows now, lost and adrift in a world that no longer obeyed their rules. She knew she couldn't stop here. The battle was far from over. The power she had unleashed had broken the hold the Chronophages had over the world, but there was still much to be done. Time was no longer the commodity it had once been. The very foundation of existence had been altered, and Maeva could feel the weight of that change pressing down on her. Her mind raced, wondering what had become of the townspeople, of the people whose lives had been stolen from them by the Chronophages. Would they remember what had happened? Would they remember her? Or would they, too, be lost to the shifting sands of time? But Maeva couldn't afford to dwell on those questions. She had made a choice, and now she had to live with it. The Chronophages may have been vanquished, but there were still remnants of their influence scattered throughout the town, still fragments of their power that would need to be addressed. Time itself, now fractured and unstable, needed to be rebuilt, reshaped into something new. And Maeva was the one who would have to do it. The realization hit her like a surge of energy, a weight settling firmly on her shoulders. She wasn't just a bystander anymore. She wasn't just someone who had been swept along by forces beyond her control. She was the one who had the power to change things, to repair what had been broken, to rewrite the world that had been torn apart. With that thought in mind, Maeva turned and walked deeper into the forest, her footsteps sure and steady. She didn't know where the path would lead, but she knew one thing for certain. She would find a way to fix what had been broken, to restore the balance of time, and to give the people of Timbrewood their lives back, no matter the cost. The Chronophages may have thought they could control time, but Maeva had proven that no one, not even them, could truly hold it in their grasp. The sands of time were hers now. Chapter 20. The Collapse of Timbrewood. Maeva's heart raced as she stood in the heart of the forest, staring at the fragments of the shattered hourglass. The sands, once endless and flowing, now lay scattered around her, lost to the winds. Yet in the emptiness, there was something undeniably potent, something that pulsed in the air like the very essence of time itself. The Chronophages were gone, their hold over the world severed, but their legacy lingered, woven into the fabric of existence like a scar that refused to fade. Time, Maeva realized, had not returned to its former state. It had been irrevocably altered. The rules that governed the passage of moments, days, and years had been rewritten, fragmented into something unrecognizable. In her efforts to dismantle the Chronophages' power, Maeva had unleashed a new force, one neither she nor anyone else fully understood. She had thought she could simply erase their influence, release the stolen time, and restore the flow of existence. But the very nature of time was more complex than she could have imagined. Now, she could feel its unstable pulse within the air, shifting and swirling like an untamed storm. Every movement Maeva made seemed to echo in the very essence of reality. A part of her wondered if she had made a mistake. Had she acted too rashly? Could she have done things differently? She had been so focused on the destruction of the Chronophages, so consumed with revenge and the desire to reclaim what had been stolen from her and the others, that she had never truly considered what would come after. She had broken the world, and now she would have to live with the consequences. But Maeva was not one to back down from responsibility. She had freed the people of Timbrewood from the Chronophages, and she would now find a way to restore balance, to rebuild the shattered pieces of time and space. She would not allow this new world to crumble under the weight of its own instability. She looked up to the sky, the clouds swirling in strange patterns above her, as if even the heavens themselves were unsure of the changes that had occurred. Maeva could feel the weight of time pressing down on her, its infinite layers of moments pressing in from all sides. But there was something else, something beyond the burden, the faintest glimmer of hope. It was as if, within the wreckage of everything she had known, something new was beginning to emerge. Maeva closed her eyes, and for a moment, she allowed herself to simply breathe. In the stillness, she felt a strange sensation tugging at her consciousness, a faint whisper that seemed to come from the very depths of time itself. It was soft at first, just a murmur in the back of her mind, but then it grew clearer, louder, as if time itself was speaking to her. Maeva. The voice was unfamiliar, yet somehow comforting, like an old friend. It was not the voice of the Chronophages. No, this voice was something else, something pure and ancient, something that had existed long before the Chronophages had come into power. It was the voice of time itself. Maeva opened her eyes, her mind racing as the weight of the voice settled in her chest. She wasn't sure how or why, but she knew this was the key to what she had to do next. The Chronophages had tried to control time, to steal it, to twist it to their own ends. But time, in its true form, was not something to be controlled. It was a force of nature, ever-flowing, ever-changing, and it could not be bound by the will of any one being. Maeva had to learn to understand time, to become its steward, not its master. She could feel that power stirring within her, just beneath the surface, waiting for her to accept it, to harness it. But to do so, she would have to confront everything she had ever believed about the world, about herself, and about the nature of time. The journey ahead would not be easy. Maeva knew that the road she was about to walk was fraught with uncertainty and peril. She would face obstacles, forces, perhaps even people, who would try to undermine her, to return the world to the old ways. But Maeva was no longer the same person who had first arrived in Timbrewood, lost and broken. She had fought, she had survived, and now she had the strength to rebuild. But rebuilding was not about restoring things to how they once were. It was about creating something new, something better, a world where time could flow freely, unburdened by the weight of the past or the manipulations of those who sought to control it. A world where people could live without fear of being erased, without fear of their memories being stolen, without fear that their lives would be snuffed out by those who believed they could hold the threads of time in their hands. Maeva's eyes narrowed as she set her jaw. The forest around her seemed to pulse with the energy of her resolve, as if it, too, was waiting for her to act. She could sense the strange presence of the Chronophages fading further into the distance, their influence waning with every passing second. But their legacy was still there, embedded within the very soil of Timbrewood, and it would take more than a broken hourglass to erase it. She turned, her footsteps firm and decisive as she began walking forward once more, deeper into the forest. The path ahead was unclear, but she had a new purpose now. She would learn to navigate the currents of time, to heal the fractures she had caused, and to ensure that the world she was leaving behind would be one where time flowed freely once more. The sands of time, she realized, were no longer a burden. They were a gift that could be shaped and molded, a gift that could be shared with the world. And she was the one who would decide how to use it. Chapter 21, A Town That Never Was. The air had grown thick with the hum of possibility. Each breath Maeva took deeper than the last, laden with a weight she could not fully comprehend. The forest around her had transformed, as if it too had recognized the shift in the balance of time. The trees, once still and muted, now swayed with an energy that mirrored the storm of thoughts within her. The ground beneath her feet felt different, more alive, as though the very earth was resonating with the pulse of the universe itself. Maeva's journey had led her to this point, but the question of what came next lingered like an unanswered prayer. She had dismantled the power of the chronophages, freed the stolen time, and yet, as the winds whispered around her, she could sense that nothing was truly restored. Not yet. The damage was not only to the town, to its people, but to the fabric of time itself. It was not enough to simply undo what had been done. Time could not be rewound, not without consequences. It had to be understood, integrated, embraced, or it would slip beyond her reach. She glanced at the sky that had been broken and reformed in ways that were beyond human comprehension. In the space where the clouds had been, the sun broke through, a strange light casting long shadows on the ground. A warmth she had not felt since before the intrusion of the chronophages filled the air, and Maeva could almost feel time stretching, like a rope held tight between two distant points, quivering under the weight of its own existence. It was then that she heard it, the whisper that had followed her since the very first moment she had come to Timbrewood. The voice of time itself. Maeva, you have broken what once was. Now you must rebuild. But first, you must understand the nature of the fracture you have caused. Maeva stopped in her tracks, the voice clear and powerful, like an ancient river flowing through her mind. She had been so focused on the end, on the removal of the chronophages and the release of time, that she had never fully considered what came after. The breaking of time was not a simple matter of destruction. It was an act of creation, one that carried its own weight, its own demand for understanding. The chronophages did not create this fracture, the voice continued. They simply manipulated what already existed. The path you walk is one that many have walked before you, though they did not know they were walking it. Maeva closed her eyes. A part of her wanted to dismiss the voice, to silence it, and focus on the task at hand. She had her work cut out for her already, after all, but deep down, she knew it was no use. The voice was not simply a presence. It was the essence of time itself, a force that could not be ignored. What do I need to understand? Maeva asked aloud, her voice trembling but resolute. The question hung in the air, unanswered for a long moment. She waited, the silence heavy around her. Then, the answer came, not in words but in feelings, in emotions that rose from the deepest corners of her soul. It was as if the very nature of time itself was unfolding within her consciousness, showing her what had been hidden for so long. Time, she realized, was not linear. It was not a series of events stacked one on top of another, neatly ordered like pages in a book. It was an endless loop, a web of connections, of cycles that overlapped and intertwined. Each moment was a thread, each thread part of a larger tapestry that reached far beyond what could be seen with the naked eye. The chronophages had only ever seen time as a resource to be harvested, to be consumed, never understanding that it could not be controlled, only experienced. Maeva was not merely a steward of time. She was a bridge, a conduit between the past, the present, and the future. It was not a responsibility she had asked for, but it was hers nonetheless. And with it came the understanding that to heal the fracture she had caused, she would need to embrace the infinite, to allow the ebb and flow of time to return to its natural state. The realization struck her like a wave, sweeping over her with a force she was not prepared for. Her body trembled, and she stumbled, gripping the trunk of a nearby tree to steady herself. Time, she now understood, was not something to be controlled. It was not something that could be bent to her will. It was something to be experienced, to be allowed to unfold naturally. She had broken it by trying to reshape it, but now she would have to allow it to heal on its own terms. Her mind whirled with the implications of what she had just learned. The Chronophages, in their arrogance, had sought to master time, to make it their own. But in doing so, they had severed the delicate threads that connected all things. They had pulled the fabric of existence apart, and now it was her task to weave it back together. But how? Maeva closed her eyes again, allowing the energy of time to wash over her. She could feel it now, not just as a force, but as a presence, a living, breathing entity that pulsed within her chest, that beat in time with her heart. She was connected to it, as she always had been, whether she had known it or not. The Chronophages had only been the illusion of control. The true power of time had always been with her. She lifted her head, a sense of purpose filling her like a flame. She would no longer fight against time. She would work with it, allow it to flow, and in doing so, she would begin to rebuild what had been lost. Maeva took a step forward, and another, her feet moving with the rhythm of the earth beneath her. She was no longer walking the path of destruction. She was walking the path of creation, of rebirth. The first step had been to release the Chronophages from their prison, but now she would give the world back the time it had been robbed of, piece by piece, moment by moment. And in doing so, she would become something more, something beyond the girl who had walked into Timbrewood so long ago. She would become the keeper of time, its guardian, its bridge between worlds. The infinite return had begun. Chapter 22. The Burden of Memory. Maeva stood at the precipice of the unknown, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the moment had arrived. It was the final hour, the last opportunity to set the universe back into its delicate rhythm before it shattered completely. Time had flowed differently since her awakening. It was no longer a steady current, but a swirling mass of possibilities, each choice, each decision, rippling outward like waves in a dark ocean. In the distance, the silhouettes of the Chronophages loomed, their once commanding figures now diminished, their power stripped away by Maeva's hand. The town of Timbrewood lay before her, a place that had once been her prison and her sanctuary, now both reborn and irreparably changed. The trees that had once whispered in her ears now stood silent, as if waiting for the culmination of her actions. The air itself felt pregnant with anticipation, each moment suspended, holding its breath, waiting to exhale. She glanced at the sky, noting the way the clouds stretched unnaturally, their edges blurring into an endless expanse that seemed to stretch on for infinity. Time, like the sky, had no clear boundaries anymore, no clear beginning or end. It had been fractured, broken, and yet somehow, here she was, standing in the midst of it, poised to restore what had been lost. But Maeva knew the price of restoration would be steep. Even as she stood on the cusp of healing the wounds of time, there was an underlying truth that gnawed at her, one she could not escape. Some pieces of time, once lost, could never be fully reclaimed. The lives that had been stolen, the moments erased, could never be perfectly restored. The Chronophages had taken time as though it were a commodity, something to be hoarded and consumed. And in doing so, they had created a rift so deep, so profound, that even now, Maeva could feel the echoes of their actions reverberating through every fiber of her being. The world would never be the same. And yet, she had to try. She had to believe that if she acted, if she made the choice to restore balance, even in the face of uncertainty, there was a chance, however small, that time could be put back on its true path. With a deep breath, Maeva stepped forward. The ground beneath her feet trembled slightly, as though the earth itself was aware of the weight of her decision. Her heart beat steadily, each pulse a reminder of her humanity, of the life she had once known, and the life she would create. As she moved closer to the heart of Timbrewood, the world around her seemed to blur, the lines between past and present growing ever fainter. The town, once so familiar, now seemed like a dream, a distant memory out of reach. And yet, it was here, in this fractured space, that the final reckoning would take place. Maeva paused in the center of the town square, her gaze sweeping over the streets she had once wandered aimlessly, searching for answers. Now, she was no longer lost. Now she understood. She was not merely a victim of the Chronophages' machinations. She had become the embodiment of time itself, a force of nature that could not be controlled, only channeled. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the trees as if urging her to act. She closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her, and allowed herself to sink into the rhythm of the earth, the pulse of time that beat beneath her skin. The knowledge she had gained, the understanding of what time truly was, flooded her senses. She raised her hands, palms facing the sky, and whispered a word, soft but clear, the syllables carrying the weight of centuries. Restore. At her command, the air around her seemed to shift. The ground vibrated, and a deep hum filled the atmosphere, rising steadily until it reached a crescendo. Maeva's body trembled, but she stood firm, her eyes closed in concentration. She could feel the time flowing through her, a vast current that surged in waves, reaching into the very core of the universe. She had become one with time, and now she would return it to its rightful place. But as the energy built to a peak, Maeva felt a tug in her chest, a deep, aching pull that reminded her of the cost of her actions. The power she wielded was not without sacrifice. Time, like everything else, had its price, and Maeva had always known that. Even as she had fought to break free of the Chronophage's grip, she was never truly free of time's hold on her. With a final, shuddering breath, Maeva released the power within her. The burst of energy that erupted from her hands was blinding, a flash so intense that it seemed to tear the very fabric of reality. For a moment, the world was nothing but light and sound, a cacophony of voices from every moment, every life that had ever been touched by the Chronophage's influence. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The light faded, and the world around Maeva shifted, slowly, gently. The air was still, the wind now silent. The sky, once fractured and distorted, had returned to its natural state, its edges crisp and defined. The trees stood tall and unmoving, their branches reaching toward the heavens, their roots deep in the soil. Timbrewood was whole again. Maeva lowered her hands, her chest heaving with exhaustion. The energy had drained from her, but there was a peace that settled over her being, a quiet, unspoken relief. She had done it. She had restored the flow of time, returned the pieces that had been stolen. But in the stillness, Maeva knew that the world had changed forever. She could never go back to the life she had known, to the person she had been. She had become something else, something more. She had become a part of time itself, woven into the threads of existence. And in that moment, Maeva understood the true nature of her journey. It had never been about saving the town, or even saving herself. It had always been about understanding the infinite dance of time, embracing the cycles, the losses, and the gains, and finding peace in the constant ebb and flow. Time, Maeva now knew, was both a gift and a curse, but it was hers to carry, and in carrying it, she had found her place in the world. As the sun set behind the hills of Timbrewood, Maeva stood alone, watching the world go on, unchanged, and yet forever different. The final hour had passed, and with it, the Chronophages and their reign over time were no more.